digital for, what's it, 12, 13 years. And he was one of the senior analytics people at Jellyfish. And he's done multiple Google Analytics 360 and now GA4 and Firebase installations. So he's the most knowledgeable person I know around Firebase. So I'll take it away, Sheldon.
Thank you. No pressure. Okay, cool. So hello, everybody. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Cool. Okay. So please stop me at any time. There's no such thing as a stupid question. I'm here to answer your questions, and we want to make this as interactive as possible. But we do have a little bit of an agenda. So what we'll be covering today is, where does app tracking fit in? I realize that does sound like a stupid question, but I've been asked it, so we will cover it. Then we have the setup process, which I think everybody's quite interested in. Then we'll talk about implementation. Funny enough, it is actually two different things. Then we can talk about events and parameters, how this all fits into GA4. And then I'm going to go through the live demo, which is of an app, a GA4 instance that has data from an app that Google has. So where does app tracking fit in? So app tracking is half of Google Analytics 4. And I'm focusing on Google Analytics 4 because it is the most robust version of app tracking at the moment. It also has obviously a lot of legacy with Google Analytics for web. So what they've done is GA4, or Google Analytics 4, is the future. It's the way everything is probably going to go, including things like Adobe and other platforms. But GA4 has now moved to an event-based data model. So what that means is, on web, you used to have a different interaction. You used to have a page view. In an app, you then have a screen view. But what Google has done in GA4 is that they've made them both events. So you will have a page view event and a screen view event, and any interaction is then an event. So where does app tracking fit in? It's half of this view. So you would have tracking set up on your website, which you generally would use GTM to fire off events into GA4. And when you go to our app side, we then use the Firebase SDK, which you then have to configure custom events and some automatic events, which then feed into GA4. So those two parts are separate, but lead to the same endpoint of GA4. I'm sure you would have seen there that the SDK for Firebase is part of this journey, and it is essential. There is no other way to get analytics app analytics data into GA4 outside of Firebase. Google owns Firebase. That is why it is part of this process. They have invested a lot in this platform, and that is it's a requirement. And to be honest, it's actually not a bad requirement. It is one of the simpler installations and implementations to do, provided your app is based on more generic or normal, in inverted commas, coding. So the reason I say that is I've experienced some apps that are based on quite bespoke code, and that does get a little complicated with Firebase. But for majority of people, Firebase will work 100%. So the setup process is, firstly, you need to have an app. Then you need to create a login with a Google account. Obviously, Google wants you to use their platform for everything. So you would use a Google account, you will log in, you'll sign in, and it will take you to something like this, which is the Firebase console. Once you get here, you can create a new project. Apps, it's generally a 1-to-1 ratio of app to project. So you will create, if you have, let's say, so the example I'm going to be using is called Flooded. It is an app that is in iOS and Android, but it is the same app. So they have the same project, meaning it's the same source of data. Once you create a project, you will then be given two screens. I'm just going to zoom in here so that you can see it. Zoom. You will then have a screen that says add Firebase to your Apple app. So you will need to have the app already registered in a store. You will then need to give the details of that app to Firebase. It will then give you the ability to download a config file, and that file will then be allowed to be installed into your app. So you'll download an SDK, you'll install the SDK, and then you do need to re-release your app into the App Store with the new code base. This is a step that, funny enough, a lot of people take for granted because GTM can be deployed without making changes on the website. So it is an important step that once you've installed the SDK, you do need to re-release your app through the App Store. So you would generally create a new version of the app. What happens after that is Firebase automatically collects around 30 or over 30 events now, if the data point or the touch point exists. So what that means is if you don't have any ads in your app, you won't get an ad engagement event. If you don't have purchases, you wouldn't get an automatic purchase event. But some of the useful events that are created are ad engagement. So obviously, if you do monetize your app with advertising, you would be able to report on that. When an app is removed, you do get a notice if it's an Android app. It doesn't apply to iOS. App Store subscription or purchase, this happens for both iOS and Android. An app update, dynamic links. So this is an interesting thing that Firebase allows. It is a link that you created in the platform that if a user clicks it on a desktop, it'll take them to a web page, or if they click it on a mobile device, it'll take them to the respective app store. So iOS for iPhones and the Google Play Store for Android. If a link is clicked, a specific event is fired in Firebase when the user opens the app. You can also track in-app messages, your first open. So if you are measuring let's call it a campaign, to see how many people download your app, you would measure your first open. Because as much as downloads are important, you do need users to trigger that first open to know that they've actually opened your app. Notification engagement, if a user clicks on a notification from your app, you can track that. It will be tracked automatically, but you can add additional information to it. Then screen view, like I said, is it's when a screen is shown in an app. If you have multiple screens, you will then automatically get this. If you're using something like a PWA or a web app, you would then need to trigger this manually. That's why it's got the little asterisk there. And then campaigns. So if you are sending media, if you are using media to send traffic to your app store, you will then automatically get some information if it is through the Google marketing platform. So there is a full list of the events. Those are the ones I think are quite important, but you do get ad click, ad exposure, ad impression, ad query. There's quite a bit of it. You can see there's quite a lot here. The ones that are quite important is you'll see that there's a difference between web and app. And the reason for that is this is a GA4 schema, meaning it's both web and app, and you can decide what you want to use across both. So if your app, for example, has a file download function where a user can download a file, you'll see here it's automatic for web. You would then need to configure it for your app. You would need to specify that as a special event. So while your dev is busy installing the SDK and you're going through the process of getting it reapproved in the App Store, our recommendation is that you should plan what else you want to track in your application. So this is very bespoke to your app. No two apps are exactly the same. And no two measurements are exactly the same. So you would want to decide what you want to track and what about a user you'd also want to know. So an example is this game again. I've got a couple examples. But for example, if you wanted a user to open the app and play a game, you would then track the opening of the app, the starting of the level, the success of the level. And I've got some examples just now. But the overall plan would be to do something like a measurement framework or a tracking plan, because the automatic events are only going to get you so far. Any other user engagement needs to be tracked as events, and it does require setup. So there's installation, and then there's implementation, which will also depend on what app you're using and what language it's coded in. So the top recommendations for GA4 is Swift or Objective-C, Java, Android, and Kotlin. I'm not even sure if I said that right. But these are the 4 recommendations, and I've got examples of what your code would look like for individual events. So in an iOS app, which is using the language of Swift, your event name would be dynamic, and then you would send in parameters like this. So that's the language you'd use. And what you can do is, because this is such a generic or robust approach to parameters and events, you can send anything you want, and you can have as many parameters as you want. So if you wanted to know anything about the user or something that they've done in their selection or anything about the user or the event, you can send it in a parameter. It just requires configuration in the app and configuration in GA4 to receive it. So I have been saying GA4 because that is the endpoint that you will report out of. Firebase is just the throughput from the app into Firebase into GA4. I've been using GA4 for a year and a half now, and I've only used Firebase once to create a report. Everything comes out of GA4, and I'm going to show you the GA4 interface just now. The other version of iOS tracking is Objective-C, where you'll see it's also, you can create a dynamic event name, and you would send parameters. There's item name and content type. So you can choose how you send your information. I've been told that Objective-C isn't used as much. It is mainly Swift for iOS. And then Android, so Java Android, you'll see as well there's a dynamic event name and the various parameters that can be set. So depending on what you want to track, and this is why we recommend doing a measurement framework of some sort, is you need to plan what you want to install. You want to plan what you want to track so that you can install the code to send that information to Firebase and then GA4. Then there's also Kotlin, which also has, you can see, a dynamic event name and parameters and values. The overall approach is more or less the same in that you do need to choose the event name, specify it, and then obviously choose the trigger that would be dependent on your app, and then send in the parameters as you want. There are some limits to GA4 or Firebase, is you can send up to 500 different events per app instance. So what that means is you could specify 500 individual engagement points outside of the automatically collected events. So things like first open in-app purchase, those aren't counted. So you can have technically 530 apps, so 530 events in your app. It is unlikely that you will ever reach that amount, because if you're going that granular, there possibly is better ways for you to group your data together. So if you were doing something as a booking engine, something like booking.com, you wouldn't need an event for every single hotel. You would have an event for booking at a hotel, and then the parameter would be the name of the hotel, for example. There is a limit on the number of characters for the event. So the event name, how many event parameters can be sent per an event. So you can have up to 25 different parameters or details about that event. There's also a limit on the character, the length of the character. And then you can also send, in addition to the 25 event parameters, you can send 25 user properties. So what that is, you could have, let's go back to the booking example, is if you've got an identifier in your app for when a user logs in that specifies this user is in the gold tier and the platinum tier, you could then say this event was triggered by a user who has the property of platinum. And that could be applied to anything. There is a demo account that you can have access to, and the deck will have a link to it, but it takes you to this app's data set, which is in GA4. So you'll see flooded. I just want to go through the screenshots first before I go into the app, into the interface. So flooded is a game. It's got a couple screens. The main point is obviously the game. So there's a menu when you open the app. There's a how to play description, and then that's the actual game, and you'll see there's an ad at the top there. So this is what you would count as events you'd want to send to analytics, but some of them would be automatically tracked. So screen view would be when the screen is shown, screen view would be this, and then level start, which is obviously the starting of the game, is the recommended name for games. So there is a schema by industry that you can use, or you can use something that's up to you. The nice thing with GA4 is that there is a freedom in the way you track and the way you name things. there's also a way to rename the events that are automatically tracked, which is quite nice. So,
Sheldon, just to interrupt you there.
Yep.
So it does seem to me that like Firebase is incredibly like powerful, because you basically coding the events, on in the app. So it's like you have this incredible power and flexibility, but it's like it's very technical to specify the events.
yes, it is super powerful. GA4 is a huge leap from GA Classic or Universal, which is because, and the reason for that is that because you specify what you want to track, you can name it to how you want to report on it as well. So that's why that measurement framework step is quite useful, to specify what you want to track.
So can I just explain the measurement
Yeah.
framework? The measurement framework is like is to just go into a workshop with some of the developers or the product owners to decide what's important and what is the sort of the flow of what users take, and then to document that. So it's like almost having a master plan before actually starting digging into the code and installing Firebase. So it's like, let's define what we want to do in English first, that everybody understands, have a plan, and then we go into this development and naming of events phase.
Exactly that's what. Thank you. So this could be these two slides could be considered a measurement framework, and that we know that there's a menu, we know there's a how to play, we know there's a level start. We also know that if you successfully finish the level, you'll get a success. You could buy in the app, and there's game over. So we have identified 6 different events here, but they would need to be translated into a trackable event name, for example. So instead of success, you could actually call it success. You could call it level complete. If instead of in-app purchase, you could call it use extra steps, because that's actually what they do in the game. You can buy additional steps. And then instead of game over, you have level fail. So there does need to be a consistency and a logic that you use when naming your events. And that's where the measurement framework does come in quite handy. Any questions so far? I've flown through quite a few slides and said a lot of things. Does anybody have any questions?
Oh, I'm good.
Okay, cool. Okay. So GA4. The interface in GA4, which I'm going to go through now in the live demo, is exactly what you will find in the Firebase interface. In Firebase, there is a section for reporting, and that is the GA4 interface. They've done that so that there's correlation between the two platforms, in that if you do one-in-one in Firebase, you know exactly where to find it in GA4. There's also a really cool section called Explore, which I'm going to do a live demo of as well. And then there is an events report, which I'm going to go through. So that is cool. Close that. So this is the Firebase interface, well, the GA4 interface for Firebase. In the reporting section, you'll see there's home, there's reports, there's explore, advertising, and configure. Home is a general screen, which is going to reload this, to show you how many people or how many users are using the app, how many new users, how much revenue you're receiving from your advertising or from your in-app purchases, depending on which model you're going with. You can report on both. I would recommend choosing one or the other to determine which one's more valuable to you. Generally, it will be in-app purchases, because that generally should give you more revenue. Average engagement time. So GA4 has moved away from session level metrics. It's coming back into the interface, but they've moved away from making that the primary way of looking at it. You want to measure the time between engagements rather than just a session that could have engagement or not have engagement. So in general, what this means is between the first and the last engagement, there's around 5 minutes. So people are playing this game for around 5 minutes. The countries obviously is quite similar to normal analytics. And then I'm going to jump into, let's do insights. So GA4, because it is an event-based data model, it allows analytics to estimate if you're using a naming convention, things like level start, level end, level finish, level fail, in-app purchases. Because those are fairly standard naming conventions, GA4 will estimate and try to give you some insights automatically. So you'll see these are, they've got this little star thing, which means it is based on machine learning. So from this insight, Mondays have consistently had the least users in the past 4 weeks. So what that means, and to take an insight and to attempt to activate it, is if you have a shopping app or a booking app or something where you want people to continually use your app, a game is interesting, but if you have a monetization strategy, you could then say, okay, Mondays have consistently had the least amount of users in the past 4 weeks. How do we activate that? Let's increase our campaign spend, or do more display advertising, or send push notifications on Mondays to try and get people back into the app. So that's the sort of where you take an insight and try and activate it to get users back into your app. Users who triggered first open. So first open is the first time a user opens the app. So that would be useful to know what was done on this day to see that, what was done on this day to cause this. That's the sort of insight you could do there. New users in India spiked. So was there a campaign in India, for example? Then going into the normal reports, you'll see here it actually does say Firebase, app develop Firebase. And this will give you a view of what Firebase would show you from an app developer standpoint. So you'll see there's users over time, which is fairly standard, users in the last 30 minutes. And then there's users by app version. This is something that is becoming more and more important, is there aren't a lot of users that have automatic app updates. So in certain situations, in certain situations, features only come out in certain versions. And if your user doesn't have a version, but you're telling them to do something in your app, they are unable to do it and they may get frustrated. So by doing this sort of analysis to see, okay, this version, which is version 2.6.5, has very high penetration, but it does say that it needs investigation. So you can click it. This is pretty good, actually. The 99% of active users are using this version, and 99.3% of them are having crash-free experiences. But there's been 187 crashes. So it needs investigation. It is just an estimate to say, have a look at this. The iOS, if I'm not mistaken, looked pretty good. It says successful. So this is specifically for developers to see what is happening in the app from a versioning, crashing, crash analytics, and usage. So you can see how frequent or how long users keep using the app for. And because this is a game, you would expect it to have a low retention rate, and that people have goldfish attention span. You can also then see in the weeks that have passed which has the highest retention. And then it starts going into analytics around the app itself to see what people are engaging with. So this is a game, so the game board would be probably the most important screen. Game over, the main menu, game finished. So something to take into account is, in this situation, if your app is based on a game, so this is a game, your game board should be the most viewed thing, not the homepage, not the menu. You'd want people to continually be in the game board. If the game over was super high, your game board would always be high because you'd have to start a game to get to game over. If your game over was higher than your game board, these are the sort of questions where, why? How is that even possible? Is there something going wrong? Are people reaching a failure point where it automatically goes game over? Those are the sort of things you can check. Then we've also got other events. So events obviously being the primary way of measuring here. It is user engagement. So that is when the app is active in the front of all the other apps on the phone. Then you've got level start quick play and level end quick play. So these are just engagements in the game that you can measure. And you can see this is very specific. It's not all apps would have that sort of naming convention. And then there's revenue, so you can see it over time. So on the 14th, on the 19th, something clearly happened. That'll be interesting to investigate. And if you are using ads in your app to monetize it, you would then get this publisher ad impressions where you could then report on the ads in the app. And be able to see which ad unit was giving you the most impressions, as well as the most clicks, if it was. So that's the Firebase section. But if you are doing any sort of engagement reporting, you'd be looking at your events. So I did touch on it just now about the level start and level end. But here you can see that this app has 40 events tracked. There's ad impression, level end, level retry, level up, level complete. These are all very specific to the app. And one of the things you'd want to do is, once you have engagement tracked in the app, you would obviously want to choose engagement that's valuable to you. And that's where conversions come in. So a conversion is a selected event that you deem valuable. And the reason why you need to specify it out as a conversion is in something like Google Ads, where you obviously are spending money, you need to optimize to a specific goal. That goal is the conversion, and that conversion can be any event you deem valuable. So this app has chosen completed 5 events, completed 5 games as the completed 5 levels as their conversion. So what they can then do is they can choose in Google Ads to optimize the campaigns to find users that are more likely to complete 5 levels. How they do that is they go into the behavior of the users who've achieved this event or completed this event, and then find users similar to them. Then you get the monetization, which
Sheldon, sorry,
shows,
just stop on the
yeah.
Sheldon, just stop on the conversions. So I'll give a practical example. So Tyler, let's say you had an app and there's a certain point or event in the app that's very useful to you, like they registered or they submitted the video or like they did something that showed their first engagement. What you can then do is that that event you can mark as a conversion. So it's like, it's almost like a soft sale, almost like an indication of this is the type of users that we want. And then what you do is you push that back into Google Ads, and then you can tell Google Ads, go and find me more of these users. So that's why it's valuable.
Right, thanks, Eddie.
Cool. Then monetization. So you'll see that this does have total revenue, e-commerce revenue, and ad revenue. So it is a little tricky to get both of them together because there is a scaling difference between a purchase and an ad revenue, depending on obviously your business model. But you'll see that here you can do purchases, and then there should be ad revenue at the bottom. Average revenue per user, paid user stickiness. So this shows this specific app is focusing on purchasing, but it also has ad revenue, which is quite cool. You can then go into your normal demographics as you would for normal. You can go into your normal analytics for demographics, where people are coming from, the different cities, genders. This is reliant on a user being signed in, or it estimates it based on their previous behavior. Then there's interests as well, which obviously Google has access to that information, age breakdown, language. And if you go into demographic details, you can drill down in a table format. You can choose a metric here, and it works. You can then choose one of the demographics, and then it'll split out your data by these dimensions. You can also look at the technology. So these are important for GA4 because as users go between screens, you'd want to know which platforms they're on. Android, iOS. So obviously Android being higher here. An important and useful piece of all of this is something called user ID, which this app doesn't have installed because you don't sign in. But if you were an app developer and your app has a login function and your website has a login function, if you have a user ID, the really cool thing with GA4 is that you can connect a user's behavior in your app and your website into a single stream of information for that user, provided they're signed in and the user ID is passed between the two platforms. What that then means is if it's set up correctly, and unfortunately this demo account doesn't have it, but if it's set up correctly, you can then view when a user's on your website, switches over to an app or switches back from an app to your website. And then you'll see that there'll be an overlap between the different platforms. In one of the accounts I've worked on, there was a group of users, I think it was like 3 or 4% of their users had all 3 devices. So they had an Android, they had an iPad, which technically counts as iOS, and a web, which is a browser. So there's a lot of combinations where that can happen. Then the really cool part, and this is possibly my favorite part, is there is this explore section, which makes your reporting really interesting in that you can do freeform, which is just table analytics, which looks very similar. You can do funnel exploration, where you choose how people move between steps. And then you have path exploration, which is my favorite, which I'm going to show, is you can choose. You can choose the different events. And because everything is an event, it is a event to event to event model, meaning session start is an event, screen view is an event. You can then drill deeper into it to see when it loads. Users then selected the content, they then viewed a screen or started a level, and then did a screen view, which is probably the game screen, and you can go down. So add impression here. The really, really cool part, which is why I love it so much, is you can go in reverse. So if you chose level complete, which is chosen in-app purchase, you can then see how users got to your specific event. And then this goes back to your measurement framework or your tracking plan, is that if you identify this last step, you can then see what all the steps are before a user completes that desired objective. You can go into advertising. So this will show you where people are coming from to your app. You can also do attribution or model comparison, which is when a user comes from different channels over time, you can then compare, was it the first click or the last click that got you your revenue? In this situation, all the revenue came from direct, meaning there wasn't a direct paid activity that brought revenue to the site. Then the last thing I want to show is custom definitions, which is the equivalent of custom dimensions. So what you do now is the parameters that we spoke about here. This one, the analytics parameters you set here need to be configured in GA4 to receive the information, and that's where you put the name there. So once you set it up, you can choose different parameters, and you can then send the information into those parameters. You do specify the scope. The only 2 scopes you get are user and event. If it's set as a user event, it'll come as a user property. If you set it as an event parameter, it'll come as an event parameter. And that is majority of what I wanted to say. There are a couple new features coming soon. There is conversion modeling based on machine learning. So you can, provided you have enough conversions in a 30, I think it's 1,000 conversions in a 30-day window, the machine learning will be able to predict how many conversions you'll get per day going forward. There's also predictive audiences based on two really cool things. So conversion probability, meaning you can pick out based on previous engagement by other users, which users are likely to convert or likely to churn. So you can build audiences based on that, meaning you can use the churn audience, meaning users that are not going to come back. You can use them as exclusions in your advertising. If you want to save money, you could do that. Then there's user lifetime value predictions, which then takes revenue as well as e-commerce revenue as well as ad revenue and predicts how long over time a user will, well, the value of a user over time. Any questions, comments? I realized that was shorter than I was expecting it to be.
No, not for me. So good to go through something that I haven't seen before. I learned a bit just on that.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone else? Questions, comments?
Yusuf, was this useful?
Sorry. Yes, it was useful. Very interesting, actually. Yeah. Thanks, Sheldon and team.
Welcome.
Okay. Stephen, I know Petio has been thinking about an app for a while, but I think Sheldon has shared some stuff that can get you going to sort of play around with it.
Yes, definitely.
Supercozy, does Soho have like an app where you can apply this? Doesn't look like Supercozy's audio is working.
I just have a quick question.
Go for it.
I'm writing a React Native application. Is this all possible in the same React Native?
So React Native you would need to possibly use the GA4 for web, because it's kind of like how a progressive web app would treat it. So you wouldn't specify automatic screen views. You would need to use something like GTM or data layer pushes to identify when screen views are changed. That makes sense.
Okay, interesting. I'll definitely look into it though.
Cool. We have identified that React and PWAs and those sort of apps are a little bit more tricky because it's technically a hybrid rather than native Swift app, for example.
Sheldon, am I correct in saying that Firebase will work across Android and iOS devices? It's not specific to iOS, for example.
Yes, it works across both.
Okay.
So you get Android Java, which is the recommended language, but it will work in both.
Okay.
So I think the biggest check to start the process is your app in an app store? Provided it is accepted by an app, because you do need to register the project for Firebase, and that needs to come out of the App Store. The App Store needs to say that it is an actual app. And then once it's in the App Store, it will work.
If there are variations, if there are variations between the Android and the iOS apps, how does that account in the dashboard?
So you'd need to code the events individually for iOS and individually for Android.
Okay.
And then they would then be treated. It's treated as two separate data streams, but in one Firebase project.
Okay, so like two different versions, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
The thing is that Android apps and iOS apps don't share. They do obviously share concepts, but they don't necessarily share the same language. So it does need to be specified one or the other.
Okay. Yeah, that's the origin of the question.
Cool. I'm not gonna lie, web was easier. HTML was a lot easier, but we are here now.
But it is very powerful though. But
it is super powerful. Yeah. There is a lot of room for customization. I think that's the key, is because not all apps are exactly the same. Not all apps do the same thing. So there is a need for customization. that bespoke approach to tracking. And this does allow for that.
Okay, cool. Is there any other questions, or should we wrap up?
Good.
I have a
Oh, here we
question.
go. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. It's actually, I'm just going to read out Sipakazi's question about how does the language affect the installation?
Is that the language that the app is coded in, or the language of the app itself? I'll answer both sides. If it's the language of the app, so the coding language of the app, there's specific code snippets for sending events, like the examples that I had in the deck, where Swift has a different. Let me share my screen again. So in Swift, which is iOS, you'll see it says log event there, whereas in Android, it goes in Firebase. Sorry, it goes in Firebase analytics.log event, whereas in here it's just analytics. So it's slight nuances in the different languages that need to be accounted for. So if your developer, your developer would know which language to use and what events, how the event should be coded. Cool.
Right. I think anything else, Yusuf? Anything from you, Mark? Anything from you?
Thanks, guys. Sheldon, I know it's quite a geeky topic for some, so it's great to be able to get someone who has experience. It's not something that a lot of people have experience with.
Thanks, Mark. But you're also a geek, so like you're in good company, yeah.
Well, yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, there's more workshops that's happening at the end of April, and then 2 more in May. You just have a look on the website, and Melissa will just post the link in the. She's already posted the link in the thing. That's it, everybody. Thank you so much for joining.
Guys.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Cheers,
Thanks,
Calvin. Thank you.
everyone.
Cheers,
Thank
Melissa.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Stephen. Bye.